Hi, my name is Jasmine, and I'll be presenting on the effects of long-term cannabis use regarding to cognition, specifically attention, mental clarity, and memory formation. So first, for Article 1, we'll be talking about acute effects of high-potency cannabis flower and cannabis concentrates on everyday life memory and decision-making. For some background, modern marijuana laws have become more loose, especially in California, and this has increased recreational use. Thus, modern marijuana laws have promoted access to high and extremely high potency cannabis products that are now very common for recreational use. Compared to old marijuana that had THC concentrations ranging from 1 to 3% in the 60s and 70s and 3 to 15% in the 90s to 2000s, modern marijuana can be now high to extremely high with THC concentrations from 20 to 60%, which is a very big difference. This presents an issue as the National Institute on Drug Abuse has a requirement for any human studies using marijuana, and they must follow the guidelines, which only allow an average of 6% THC to be used in the studies, and thus this is not representative of many of the current products on the market. So first, what was the question? The researchers wanted to investigate the cognitive effects of modern high-potency cannabis products, specifically in regards to memory and decision-making. There have been previous theories that suggest higher THC content results in more cognitive delays. Also, there are conflicting studies around the presence of CBD, as some believe that it has a potentiating effect on the cognitive delays, but others say it has a mediating effect. So, researchers wanted to study how everyday life memory and non-normative, which means not risky, decision making is affected, as there has been a lack of research on these topics, as most studies rely on the low percentage required by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And for the hypothesis, we have high potency marijuana use would impair memory and decision making compared to a sober condition, and that CBD inclusions would produce less detrimental results than the products with no CBD. And for methods, we have a between subject design. There were 80 experienced cannabis users that were randomly assigned to 4 groups. There were 2 conditions. There would be one sober and one intoxicated. The sober group was the control group, and the intoxicated was divided into 3 different subgroups with different versions of cannabis. The first one was THC flower with a high percentage, which would be around 20%. The other one would be THC with CBD, so the included CBD, and the other one would be cannabis concentrates, which are the extremely high percentage of THC, around 60% and 70% with CBD. So the participants would consume cannabis and then they would be cognitively tested after, like the confidence test, framing test, and sunken cost test. So here we can see they were divided and then they went under a baseline assessment, which would be used later to compare the scores, investigate for a cognitive decline. And then we see the various forms of testing. So, everyday life memory, specifically free recall, memory accuracy, and source memory, were significantly impaired while intoxicated with high potency cannabis compared to being sober. However, there is no significant difference regarding the non normative decision making. So, this means there was a very significant impact on memory accuracy. So, when they were called to recall something, they often got it wrong, or they even had false memories, which would be memory distortion, but they didn't seem to have a very significant effect on their decision-making skills. Additionally, researchers failed to prove that CBD can have protective effects against the detriments of THC and failed to prove a worsened effect by concentrate versus flower. So their other hypotheses were not proven. However, their first one was proven successful. In these charts, we can see that there has been a significant effect. Here is a recall. So sober, they did much better than under the influence, and we can see there's a significant p-value, and also this is for the test for source memory ID pictures. It is also significant. And here we have false memory, so that would be like memory distortions and recalling things that didn't happen. So we also see that there's a significant difference, meaning that when intoxicated, they were more likely to have memory distortions than when sober. And then here, while some of these are not very significant, this is in comparison to all the compared groups versus just the sober group. THC and CBD flower group had significantly poor free recall pictures on the source memory test than the sober control group, with a p-value of 0.1, and then Similarly, THC and CBD flower groups performed significantly worse on the free recall trial of the false memory test with a p-value of 0.02, which is significant. So overall, the results did support the first hypothesis and further theories that suggest chronic marijuana use can be detrimental to everyday cognitive tasks, specifically disruptive to the hippocampal memory processes and memory formation. Um, However, the side hypothesis is and side discussion was that the concentrates resulted in faster intoxication, which means that they believed that because the concentrate allowed the participants to get intoxicated faster, they would in turn inhale less fumes and reduce harm by less lung exposure. Additionally, while it was not proven, they found that CBD did not provide any protective factors and even worsen effects in some cases. For Article 2, we will be going over long-term cannabis use in cognitive reserves and hippocampal volume in midlife. For the question, the researchers wanted to study the cognitive effects on cognition and brain structure into midlife after frequent long-term cannabis use. The researchers in this article had three different hypotheses. The first one being that long-term cannabis use is associated to cognitive impairment in the midlife. The second one being that long-term cannabis use leads to a smaller hippocampal volume. And the third one is that the cognitive delays are directly associated with this decline in hippocampal volume. So basically, their third hypothesis was that these are correlated and that the cause of the cognitive decline can be traced back to this smaller volume. This study was a longitudinal study, and it first used a from birth cohort. So it followed a group of people from birth to the age of 45, and it measured cannabis use at ages 18, 21, 26, 32, 38, and 45. And IQ was measured both in childhood, which was ages 7 to 11, and then again at age 45. And at 45, the participants underwent various cognitive tests, and the hippocampal volume was recorded through MRI scans. And they were divided into 5 comparison groups against the first one, which would be long-term cannabis users. And they were also evaluated based on some trusted contacts or friends had to complete questionnaires about their participants' memory. So this would include their ability to return calls, if they forgot to do errands, and if they were known to be easily distracted or sidetracked. We have 3 findings. The first one being that long-term cannabis users revealed an IQ decline with a mean of negative 5.5 IQ points. So this means that this was a significantly larger decline than in comparison groups. This correlates with the hypothesis that predicted a cognitive decline. The second is that long-term cannabis users scored worse on learning and processing. This again goes along with the cognitive decline, and that long-term cannabis users had a decline in hippocampal volume compared to all other groups. However, there's not enough statistical evidence to correlate the cognitive decline with the hippocampal volume. So although these are both occurring findings, they are not correlated. So overall, the findings are that long-term cannabis users displayed a more significant decline in IQ, cognitive test scores, and hippocampal volume than both non-users and recreational users. For our charts, we can see here that in the IQ scores, that there's a significant difference between child IQ, which was deemed normal at the time, and adult IQ, which declines around 5.5 IQ points. And here we see that these p-values are significant when comparing long-term users with cannabis non-users. In this chart, we see this was based on the informant reported memory and attention scores, so the close friends verifying that they had issues with memory or attention, like were easily sidetracked. And we see here that there's a significant difference between long-term and non-cannabis users. And this means that overall, long-term cannabis users were anecdotally found to have worse memory and attention in everyday things as observed by others. So overall, long-term cannabis use is associated with cognitive deficits in the midlife and loss of cognitive capacity not only during use, so in everyday life. And the hippocampus is essential for memory and learning, and thus the significant volume loss is very concerning. And the hippocampus is also a center that deals with memory and learning, thus this decline is a risk factor for dementia. And as marijuana users grow, public health policy should address and raise awareness about these long-term effects rather than only the immediate effects. For final takeaways, I have that long-term cannabis is linked to cognitive decline and may be even more severe due to rising levels of THC potency. And cannabis has a multifaceted effect on the brain, not in just one region like the hippocampus. It probably affects the brain in many different ways. Overall, more research is needed, and these risks should be considered when making policies regarding public health. Thank you.